Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited in a weird way to talk about a topic that I'm really passionate about, which is the intersection of technology and mass atrocity. This is a big picture of my face. I show that only to share a little bit of my background. As you heard, I am the CEO and founder of ReadySet, also CEO and I'm also a co-founder of Project Include and a new initiative called Build Tech We Trust. But before I did this work, I was an international human rights lawyer. There's a picture of me, my back, in Afghanistan. I worked there. I worked in a lot of countries and contexts around the globe. In addition to Afghanistan, I worked in Thailand on the Burmese border, Nicaragua, and Europe on topics ranging from counterterrorism to international labor law. And I think this gives me a little bit of a unique perspective. There are a lot of people here who are going to talk to you about technology, and they're very equipped to do that. I wouldn't dream of stepping on their toes. I'm here to talk about something a little bit different, which is people and mass violence, how it affects societies, and the weaknesses that we have that help it take hold. And I will say before I go on, when I moved to Silicon Valley, in some ways I thought this work was a little bit lower stakes, the work of D&I. I didn't understand when I moved here the risk that tech posed and the potential problems it could cause. Of course, for me, that changed. Not just during the election, but also just getting more familiar with the technology itself. And this came to a head this year after the Gilroy, El Paso, and Dayton shootings, in which time me and several co-founders of mine, who are all leaders in tech and CEOs of color, launched Build Tech We Trust. And we launched it because after these shootings, we found ourselves really stunned by just the sort of rapid succession of terrorist attacks in the US and the silence of our industry, right? We knew these attacks were being coordinated on technology platforms, and we kept waiting for leaders in tech to say something, and they didn't. And because our communities were some of the communities that were targeted, we were heartbroken. And so we launched this. And like a lot of tech initiatives, we launched with a statement online, but we decided we didn't want to end there. And in fact, we all said that we wouldn't do this if it was just going to be a statement. And since then, we've decided to focus on two key areas for two key groups of people. Those areas are education and advocacy, and those people are people working in technology. We really want to empower people and build community amongst the rank and file tech workers. We feel like for so long, this conversation's really been had between civil society and tech leaders, and we want to get more tech workers involved. And we also want to help support policymakers who are critically thinking about this with the perspective from the industry. So that's what we're going to try to do. But I want to take a step back because I'm going to spend this talk mainly talking about the problem and how we got here. So when I moved to Silicon Valley, I was really captivated by tech's optimism. Tech was supposed to be the solution to all of our problems. Access to information, access to sustainable energy, the way we communicate with each other, how we work together, access to healthcare, access to transportation, and access to education. And we now know that didn't quite work out how we thought it was going to, right? And even where it did, it came at a really high cost. And so the question that I'm trying to answer today is why? Why did this happen? And I think Kentaro Toyama provides us with a useful framework to think about this, to think about how the technology that was supposed to connect us ended up dividing us, right? Why was it not able to fulfill his promise? Mr. Toyama is a computer scientist and the former head of Microsoft Research India. And after his experience in India, he wrote this book called Geek Heresy, because basically what he found is that Microsoft was trying to deploy all of these educational technologies in India, and none of them really worked that well, and he wanted to know why. And so in his work, he explores a concept called the law of amplification. And what the law of what the law of amplification basically says is that technology's primary effect is to amplify human forces, whether that's our inclinations, whether that's our biases, our prejudices, whether it's our societal divides, whether it's power. Technology is not inherently good, bad, or neutral. It amplifies what's already there. And I think this is a useful framework for us to think about mass atrocity today too, because I would posit it that we can't really understand mass atrocity and technology's role in it until we understand ourselves. And so I'm going to ask that to get today, you all indulge me a little bit and we engage in this process of critical reflection of our industry, our society, and ourselves. And I know these sessions have been a little bit interactive so far, so I want to try to make this interactive too. I'm going to present you with a lot of different paradigms. If you all have questions as I'm going, I'm happy to stop and answer them. But that's what I'm aiming to do in the time that we have. So I first want to start out with the industry, seeing the industry better. What is it about the tech industry and the solutions they build that make it so easy for people to weaponize their hate? And I would posit one big thing about the industry is its history of bias and exclusion. And I may be a little biased myself in this since I work on this every day, but I think it's a significant thing, and we often, I don't think, give enough attention to it and its history in understanding its impacts today. And so I want to start out by saying that, you know, tech wasn't always dominated by dudes, right? You see here women from one of the first teams working on our early computer, 1946, and at that time, 50% of the women on that team, 50% of the people on that team were women, including Grace Hopper. But as with other occupations, as technology and tech careers got more lucrative, women got pushed out. This is one of the ways this happened, and this is kind of my favorite way, is through assessment. So there are these two psychologists, I think Cannon and Dallas, I want to say, who developed this assessment in 1956 for a software development company, trying to figure out who the ideal programmer was. And so in order to do this, they interviewed 1,400 people, 1,200 of whom were men. So you can you can imagine how that went. And as one of their sort of metrics in the assessment, they built in the idea, without any evidence really whatsoever, that the ideal programmer was somebody who wasn't good with people, who was a loner, and that sort of became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you can see, luckily they illustrated their report for our own edification. You can see here their picture of the ideal programmer. He's always a guy. Sometimes he smokes and he's angry. Sometimes he's working on trains and puzzles. He's always working in isolation. He's always tinkering. And that stereotype persists to this day, right? And it's important to know that wasn't accidental. It's not a reflection of merit or who has a personality conducive to programming. It's an intentionally constructed stereotype. And were you to assume that maybe the sexism in this report was implicit and not explicit, here's another picture from it. And so you can sort of see what they were trying to do. They were trying to construct a masculine field dominated by people who had traditionally masculine traits, and it worked. From 1984, we saw a drop in computer science majors from 36% to 18%. We also saw stagnation along racial lines, stagnation which persists to this day. Even after we have had these huge diversity pushes, we know that the share of ethnic minorities is quite low, much lower than it was, for example, in the 80s, and the share of women has only increased incrementally. And now we see headlines like this, right? Just the what's happening? Why is this such a failure? What's going on? We tried our best. It took 5 years. We don't know what to do right now, right? And I think it's super important to contextualize this historically because, you know, while these headlines are all from 2017 to today, this project, the project of homogenizing tech, has been one that's a lot longer. It's a 50-year project, right? So we can't actually expect to solve it. But it has had some very real-world impacts. And I would argue that tech companies built on exclusion, built exclusive platforms. And the leaders of those companies themselves, because they came from such a homogenized group, didn't take the threat on those platforms seriously. They didn't understand it, and because it didn't happen to people that looked like them, they didn't take it seriously. And like a disease, it metastasized. And this doesn't just happen globally. I mean, domestically. These blind spots obviously are global. And I see a headline like this, and I want to make a sarcastic comment, which I'm actually going to make right now, which is, it takes a really big blind spot to say, hey, I'm going to take this platform, a platform that brings people together. I'm going to drop it into another country, a country whose context I don't understand, a country that may have deep social divides, and say, hey, get on it and say whatever you want, and then we'll see what happens, right? And that's really what happened here. And this is a sort of picture. This is a picture of a post taken of some of the posts against the Rohingya. And you could say the same thing with this, right? Who says I'm going to go into a country, one of the most diverse countries in the world, Burma, that has been embroiled in ethnic conflict, the longest running ethnic conflict in the world, so over 50 years, ruled by a military junta. Give them a propaganda machine, and we're going to see what happens, right? It's pretty easy to anticipate the outcomes if you think about it critically. And yet, again and again, we find these companies are caught off guard. And it's not just about the platforms. It's also about how they value then the work of dealing with the threat. And we see up until very recently that work has been outsourced. And the emotional labor that goes with it has been outsourced. And so it hasn't really been handled very well. And even where they do try to handle the threat, their blind spots means that they often focus on the wrong folks. So in this study, we find that AI, when flagging content, is much more likely to flag content. So I think it's 1.5 more times more likely to flag content written by African Americans, and 2.2 times more likely to flag content written in African American vernacular. Right, so instead of policing people who might be aligned with the threat, we end up policing the people who traditionally get policed. But it's not just the tech companies, the culture of the companies, and the tools that they build. I would also argue that there are rifts in society that make us even more vulnerable to these technologies. And if we're going to think about how do we solve a problem like misinformation and radicalization, we must also understand ourselves a little bit better. So first, I want to talk about these deeply entrenched divides. I really push up against the myth that technology itself, when it's just deployed, is automatically going to bridge a gap. It's not. And in fact, what we found is that technology can be used those gaps can be exploited, and technology can be used to deepen divides. A few examples: America's growing political divide. So we know that America is more politically divided than ever. This is an ad crafted by the Russians. Great job, guys. From the 2016 election that kind of focused on sowing division between liberals and conservatives, but also within the liberal faction itself. And what the Russians really leaned into in 2016 was America's racial divide. And if you've studied insurgent tactics and the way people target America, is actually not new. People have exploited America's racial divide for propaganda for years, recruiting black troops in the field during Vietnam to now. And the Russians particularly focused on the Black Lives Matter movement. So you see one example of that where there's the woke blacks page. Oh, of course, that sounds really really African American, and the badge page, right? And they found that this division was really effective. But it's not just domestic either; it's also global. And people exploited our global divides to test the mechanisms which they would use to influence our political divides. One great example of this is Cambridge Analytica's work in Trinidad and Kenya, right? Two developing countries that are less on our radar because of the fact they're developed, because they're predominantly Black. Cambridge Analytica tested some of the techniques they would later use in the 2016 election there. So I think that's one way that we see that socially and societally we have a weakness. And I think the other way comes in how we actually handle terrorism. And I use the word terrorist really intentionally because when we look at these instances of violence, particularly in the US, instances which target civilians that are meant to sow discord and unrest and make people feel unsafe, instances which might not have a high body count, but the point is not that. The point is to create chaos. Those are terrorist attacks. And we don't say that they're terrorist attacks because of the way that the people who commit them, what they look like. And I think that's one of our biggest problems, and that's why, for example, we government agencies have been really slow to take the threat seriously. We know, for example, DHS only this year labeled, declared that white supremacy was a threat, even though white supremacist attacks have been increasing for years. We don't think that terrorists look like this. We and the FBI, who made this poster, think that they look like this. And this is a poster that the FBI put plastered on a couple of buses and later took a lot of heat for because, as you'll notice, there are so many ethnicities represented in this poster, save one, right? And yeah, I think it can be said that part of the global terrorism threat looks like this, but it also looks like this. And if we're not paying attention to this global terrorist threat, the global terrorist threat that is on the rise, then we're going to be unprepared to deal with it. And this isn't just in the area of the public agencies. We also see this in organizations like the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which is a consortium put together by the big tech companies to counter extremism on their platform. And until I think September of this year, they primarily focused on Islamic terrorism. And had very little work done on white extremists. And so all of this is to say that, yes, while the technology and the culture of tech companies is dangerous, these social divides also make us susceptible. And as we're thinking about how to solve these problems, we can't just look at how we fix the technology. We must also look at how we fix these divides in society. A small project, I know. I'm just going to add one layer to it, which is us. And I think that there are certain things about us as people in this moment that make us really vulnerable. And if we don't critically interrogate ourselves, even if we fix the technology, even if we fix the society, I don't think we're going to fix the problem. So let's talk about us. We're angry, we're struggling, we're resentful. It's an optimistic picture I'm painting today. But I'm not just, the optimism is going to come, but I'm trying to be real right now, you know what I mean? And we live in a country where the wealth divide is growing and social outcomes are decreasing. Outcomes like access to education, outcomes like life expectancy. I recently read a report that millennials' life expectancy, how many millennials are there in the room? Guys, the news is not good for us. It dramatically decreased when looking at generations prior because of our access to healthcare and the increasing costs of healthcare, because of the stress put on us, because of our lower incomes. We're likely to die much sooner, not just a little sooner, but much sooner than our parents and our people in other generations. Yeah. And so, obviously, we're stressed out about that as a country, and we're angry, and anger makes us make bad decisions. We don't make rational decisions when we're angry. We're susceptible to deceiving messages. We're susceptible to messages that frankly don't make sense but emotionally appeal to us. We're susceptible to algorithms that put extreme content in front of us to keep us interested and motivate us to click. Right? That anger makes us vulnerable. We're also threatened, and these perceptions of threat exacerbate the anger. And there are two big threats that I want to point out today, threats that played a large part in swinging the 2016 election, which are group status threat and identity threat, right? So social identity threat is basically when you perceive that members of your in-group are under attack. You think that people are talking about in-groups that you're part of in a negative way. It makes you feel defensive about your social identity. That happened during the 2016 election. That's what all of those Black Lives Matter posts that Russia put up did. That's what they exacerbated. That's the response they were intending to provoke amongst people, particularly white people, was the sense that their identity was being attacked. At the same time, we saw that the US was becoming increasingly diverse. We had just had our first Black president, and white people also felt like they were losing ground, which is part of group status threat, or when you feel like members of your group are no longer receiving the same privileges that they want to. These perceived threats and the anger that they created were exploited. And so it's important to think about these cognitive processes and the backlash they promote when we're interrogating how we think and what makes us vulnerable to misinformation. But finally, and I think this is really important, we're also lonely, right? The technology that we lean on and that we're so invested in has isolated us. 3 in 10 millennials say they always or often feel lonely. Since 1980, the share of Americans that say they feel lonely has gone from 20% to 40%. And loneliness makes us vulnerable. It is what extremists target. They want lonely people, and they promise them a sense of community and purpose in exchange for their allegiance, right? And the younger they are, the better. And so the result, I would argue that because of the phenomenons I've just highlighted, several tensions have emerged, tensions that make us rife for violence. The first is that tech's founding myths leave it unprepared to deal with the violent real-world impact of its actual culture and decisions. If you believe your industry is a meritocracy, if you believe you're building a platform that's going to change the world that communicates, you're probably not going to take the Nazis on it seriously, right? Our society. Organizations exploit divides at scale while the threat goes unappreciated. Same thing. If you think that, hey, white supremacist organizations like DHS doesn't think they're a terrorist threat, the FBI is not looking at them, how bad can they be? It's just talk online. And then you're not appreciating the threat. And finally, in ourselves, I think we're unprepared. We have been unprepared to deal with the backlash. So we didn't understand why increasing visibility and advancement of less privileged groups would result in backlash. And we didn't know that they would lead us to want to regress to a more status quo. We find ourselves searching for connection and meaning online, and sometimes those searches result in more tribalism and exclusion. I think a great example of this too happens with older folks. So I read a slew of articles that talk about how older people go online, go on YouTube, go to find connection, and that's how they get radicalized in their older age. And what happens is misinformation spreads. This is a chart that was actually reflective of a wonderful case study that happened in Toronto when there was a tech attack there. A journalist tweeted correct information and incorrect information. This shows how fast that information spread. So the correct information was that the terrorist was white. The incorrect information was the terrorist was Middle Eastern. So even though that person issued a correction and tweeted the accurate account, that accurate account got no traction. It was the false account that took off, because that's the one that people wanted to read. And we're seeing the real world impact, increased terror incidents in the US for the past 15 years. They're still going up. And we also see that terrorists are talking to each other and inspiring each other and referencing each other in their manifestos. We see this because they're putting it online. The evidence is out there. And this is a really great chart produced by the New York Times, which shows the sort of conversations between terrorists and terrorist attacks. So how the Christchurch attack was influenced by, for example, the Norway attack, right? This is an international conversation that terrorists are having. And at home, they're resulting in headlines like this. But I want to leave us with something hopeful, because if the law of amplification is true, It's not just the bad stuff that's getting amplified. There's also good stuff out there too. And I think talking about some of the good stuff gives us tools to think about how we solve the stuff that we need to solve when it comes to this issue. So where do I find hope? Ironically, in Twitter. So the first is Black Twitter. I, as a Black person, love the Black Twitter. In part because, I grew up in a community that was predominantly white. I didn't see a lot of people who look like me. I always thought of my experience as being abnormal and irregular, and it was hard for me to find community. It's hard for me to find validation. It was hard for me not to just feel weird walking around in my own body. And, Black Twitter, as it's grown and emerged, and other communities like it have come into prominence, has changed that and sort of allowed me to see a little bit more what the universal experience of being someone like me looks like, even if that's not necessarily reflected in the media or the communities that I'm a part of in real life. And I think that's really powerful. I also think that there's a lot of critique of Humans of New York. I'm going to take a mushy view of it and say that, the technology also allows us to build communities and tribes around good things and to explore the different lives of the people within our groups. And, there's always, it's a double-edged sword, but, something like this, seeing the diversity and complexity of a city like New York is a beautiful thing, especially when we still have to struggle against narratives like Sex and the City or Girls or Friends, where a diverse, rich community, rich city like New York is often portrayed in one particular way. Also, movements like Me Too and the emergence of other mechanisms of accountability. And I tie this closely to the increased representation, the removal of gatekeepers, and the voice that marginalized folks can have online, and how those voices can coalesce into something like the Me Too movement, and how they can serve as a lever for accountability when things like our justice system don't work. But I also think that tech is great for things like employee activism. Tech Won't Build It, Tech Workers Coalition. I came from an international labor background, and when I moved here, I was like, why aren't these dudes talking about unions? Why isn't there collective action? Why does everybody think they're special? And we're seeing now that that's no longer the case, and people are starting to see that actually we have a common cause together, and the organizations we're fighting are huge. They're powerful, and the only way we're going to be effective is through collective action. And some of that collective action is happening online. It's really exciting, and it's not just happening with employees inside of tech, it's happening across society, right? So thinking about modes of collective action like Color of Change, the petitions and the lobbying that they're doing, change.org, the same thing. I find hope there. And I know that you probably want a slide that's a what can we do slide. I had that slide in here and I took it out because I was like, there's not a lot of good information on this slide. Because I think, as we can see, from the presentation and the sort of framework I'm presenting to you, the problem's really complicated. It's multi-layered. It's with us, it's with our society, it's with our technologies, and having 5 bullet points, one of which is protect your privacy. Okay, great, how do I do that? I don't think it's as useful. That said, we're thinking about it. If you wanna work with us as we work in coalitions with other organizations who are thinking about this and who are advocating in the interest of the general public against some of this stuff, feel free to look us up, feel free to join us. Here's a list of some of the resources I use, some of which I highly, highly recommend. And feel free to shoot me down if you have a critical view of some of these. I loved Mindfuck. I'm not just saying that so I can curse in front of you, but I thought it was a really good account of Cambridge Analytica and sort of the neo-colonial culture that was there and how that was leveraged to really test some of their techniques and later pilot them in the US. I just thought it was a really good perspective. Geek Heresy, where this law of amplification is presented, is really good. And Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, and How the Internet Era is Transforming Kenya is also a really good non-US-centric view that I think is quite informative. And finally, I will say Nervous States. I would recommend you read that if you want to better understand what's happening to us politically and how these political changes are being exploited. Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm going to stop talking, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them.
Hi, thank you. That was a fabulous presentation. My question is, when we're thinking about nuanced responses to versus like blanket, don't use this platform or shut something down. You brought up the Rohingya example of the spread of disinformation on Facebook, and I think Facebook's initial thought was like, oh, we'll just stop promoting this content. But then locally, the groups actually asked, well, please don't. It's our only way to track where this content is spreading, and it's our only source of news from that group. And then another example, I guess, Facebook too, where, you know, when they were encrypting their messaging platforms, and that removed a way to track essentially terrorist groups and kind of extreme messaging there as well. So curious to get your thoughts on as platforms are struggling with that kind of content moderation, especially when it comes to mass atrocities and things like genocide.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually see a lot of parallels with that with my work in international development, which is that I think the biggest danger these platforms pose is they're built in the U.S., decision-making power rests in the U.S., and they sort of uniformly deploy these tools in places and contexts they fundamentally don't understand, where they don't have teams who understand them as well, and they deprioritize those people. When I was working in international development, we saw this a lot, right? Like the UN or whomever, the State Department, would come into a place and they would say, here's our farm workers program. And the farm workers program would be like, get some seeds or whatever. Something that did like not work in this context. Actually, a great example was in Afghanistan, where they were working with farmers to develop chicken farms, and they were just like, it was a very American perspective. It was like, we're going to give you some chickens. That was the program, right? And then for a lot of reasons, it didn't work because they didn't understand the context. The context wasn't locally informed, and they did more harm than they did good. And so I guess to answer your question, I think the part of the key is to decentralize organizations like this and decentralized decision-making power when they're deploying to these contexts. Like, I think even today, Facebook doesn't have the big enough team to represent all of the languages spoken in Burma, right? It's like the most diverse country in the world, not just ethnically, but also linguistically. I worked with Burmese refugee camps where people were fleeing the conflict, incredibly diverse, incredibly fractured. And those ethnic divisions are deeply sown. And so you can't just have like one or two Burmese speakers to monitor posts there and say whether or not they're okay, because like they're the Karen, they're the Karenni, they're, you know, the Rohingya, there are all of these groups who have their own languages, their own norms, and understand their threats differently. And so it's a very expensive problem to tackle if you're going to fully appreciate the context. But I think really decentralizing decision-making, really giving local people a voice and consulting before you roll out the technology, pilot the technology there, I think it would probably be my response. But I just acknowledge that's really expensive and really complex, and that's why people don't do it. So.
We still have time for another question? Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. Like your last answer showed, I really loved how you're connected all these global perspectives to the impact of technology on the domestic issues, because I think being in the U.S., the U.S. issues definitely come to the forefront more often. And I guess it sounded like maybe you're hinting at this in your previous answer, but I'm curious as to what led to maybe you personally deciding to go from the global perspective, working global issues like international development, to come back to the U.S. and work on tech companies. Maybe a different way of phrasing that is like, what work do you think that somebody who is coming from an American context could do directly in a global perspective?
Yeah, so for me, the decision to come back home was very personal. I found myself as an American working on conflicts and in contexts that were removed. It was like a luxury. You know, I don't want to say that like, it wasn't like I was playing, but it's a lot easier to work on violence when the violence can't touch you and when you're in a position of privilege. which, you know, I got to occupy. I could also have a whole separate talk about what it's like to be a Black woman in development. It's hilarious. Everybody assumed I was African and talked down to me, but which was so stupid. But I think that, like, when I was away, I saw things like the Trayvon Martin shooting. I saw the emergence of Black Lives Matter. I saw what I felt like my communities were under attack, and I was like, okay, so, you know, I'm kind of putting on, you know, your elite educated anthropologist hat and going to these countries and playing around in some sort of neo-colonial who knows what, and my people are dying back home. Like, what am I really doing here? And then I thought, well, how can I help? And I've always been passionate about work, workers' rights and labor, and especially the last place I was in was Nicaragua, where I was working with sugarcane workers who were dying of occupational illness, and I really wanted to continue that work and think about the relationship of work to economic empowerment and structural violence here. So that's why I started ReadySet, because that was the way that I could do it. Those were the skills that I had, and that was the way that I could see that I could have impact on my community.
Thank you so much for your talk. You know, as you're talking about like workers' rights and what working conditions are like, you know, here in the U.S., outside the U.S., that's something I've been thinking about a lot, about how my consumer dollar impacts that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think for a long time, like, you know, several years ago, there was the big fire in Bangladesh at I think it was a garment factory. Mm-hmm. And for many years, I thought that these were clothes that were bought, you know, at inexpensive places or more, you know, kind of like trendy things. And the more I read about it, I realize that even like the very high end, you know, like these leggings that you pay $80 for, these coats that you pay hundreds of dollars for, come from places where workers are not given the, I would say, the quality of life that at least I feel like is expected. How do I, as a consumer, like understand like if what company is making the right ethical choices so that I can spend my $200 on a coat that I feel like has been made by a worker that has been paid fairly? Like, how do I as a consumer do that?
Ooh, that's super hard. Okay, so I used to, I explored what you're talking about, CSR, responsible sourcing, that sort of thing, while I was doing the work with the sugarcane workers, because sugar is a notoriously difficult supply chain. And so I think what you're asking, there are some case studies around this that may be helpful. So like the student campaign against Nike and the Nike sweatshops may be helpful for you. I think that in the wake of that, there was some movement to have more responsible manufacturing processes, et cetera. However, on the ground, how that's been implemented is really not transparent. And not only that, but, you know, different places have different regulatory regimes and provide different levels of oversight. Companies have self-interest in not closely monitoring their factories and making CSR like a marketing thing and not necessarily a thing that actually impacts how they manufacture. So in short, it's really hard. And I think like you can rely on brands that sort of say like we're responsibly sourced, we're only made in the US, et cetera. Does that mean that their supply chain is actually pure and not without some exploitation? Probably not. I think where it's really bad, you know, leveraging your dollars as part of a consumer boycott has been effective in the past and probably will be. But the issue is so widespread, you know, that has to be really tactical and really strategic. So I would say that. I'm also a big fan of not consuming fast fashion and really thinking about how do we more sustainably consume clothing? How do we recycle clothing? How do we make it so that companies are not incentivized to keep producing like this and really exploit cheap labor to meet market demand? So I don't know if that response is helpful to you, but.
I have a question on employee activism in tech. Do you think is it any different from any other industry's employee activism? And if it is, or if it needs to be more effective, what are some good tips to continue to do that?
Well, I'm going to say yes and no. I think that employee activism in tech, particularly where it's waged by technologists, is slightly different. Because unlike what we see in campaigns with low-wage workers or in like blue-collar industries like manufacturing, there's a premium placed on technologists in this industry. Whether rightfully so or not, we find that the technologist employees in these companies especially when they're working together. And this is actually getting harder and harder. I would argue they have a lot of power to ledge. They're very expensive. It costs companies a lot when they leave, and they can't build their products without them. So I think that that's a differentiating factor. But that said, I actually think tech still has a lot to learn from other solidarity movements and in understanding how workers in other industries who have less power organize. And I still think that there's a lot of exceptionalism in tech, like we're special, we're different from other workers. Our companies that sold us on their culture actually really care about us and weren't making financial decisions and engaging in employer branding to pull us in. We're not being exploited. I think that there's that while there's a rising consciousness, I think it's still really hard for people and technology, particularly technologists with privilege, to understand their limited power and how to leverage that effectively in organizations that are, really using them to make money, because that's the point of a company. So yeah. And lessons I would offer for that, I think that there's some really great employee activism happening already. So thinking about what's happening with Tech Workers Coalition, as I mentioned before, Tech Won't Build It. I would like to see more cross-industry campaigns. So I would like to see tech working more with labor. I think we've already seen low-wage tech workers, like people on Uber, Uber drivers, working in solidarity with technologists. I would like to see more of that. I think if we're able to collectively leverage our power on both sides and do so in a way that's really uniform within companies, but also across the industry, I think that's where we stand to really get some momentum, and that's where we have a lot of power. Any other questions? Well, when I say maybe if there are people who are hard of hearing, I would like for them to hear.
Awesome talk. Your thoughts on spreading misinformation. I mean, one of the main algorithms that pops up information at Google is PageRank. And when we're fighting against PageRank, I mean, how we mitigate misinformation when we have such a great engine, great here and not so sure about the greatness, but basically taking into account quantitative information, the number of clicks, as opposed to the quality of those clicks or actually the veracity of the information that is being spread. So what do you do, perhaps personally or within some of the institutions that you engage?
So I think, there's an economic incentive here, which is that, those algorithms are designed for clicks, to support ad dollars, and that's they want you to stay on there for as long as you can. And that's part of why I highlighted the emotional way in which we approach some of these technologies. They exploit that to keep us clicking, and that makes us susceptible to not just the misinformation itself, but to continually receive it. That being said, I think that there are some lessons that we can learn. The Kenya example is a good one. And so misinformation was deployed in the 2017 Kenyan elections, I think, or actually, no, it was 2013, fairly well, right? It was really effective because the country was new to Facebook. It was new to these social platforms, and so people saw the information on it and were just kind of like, oh, this is true, or oh, this is not propaganda. And but then what happened in 2017 is that you got more digitally savvy users. This is also happening with digital natives, where they're like, this is bullshit. You know what I mean? Like people spot it more. And I think we see this in the U.S. where digital natives are less susceptible to propaganda and misinformation than people who have spent less time online. So I think that I always educate that people get savvy, that people not put their faith in platforms, that people understand that these are companies that don't have the public interest in mind. And a lot of what you're seeing, whether you want to believe it or not, on those companies are advertisements. And the information that's being presented by people that you don't know is likely not neutral. So approaching platforms with skepticism. As for what to do internally in companies, look, as long as there's a profit incentive for people to keep folks engaged and people keep engaging with the content, it's really hard. That our industry is built on those ad dollars, and our industry is pressured to really lean into those ad dollars and try to scale at an incredibly huge pace because of the way that it's financed. And so this this goes all up and down the chain. And I think if you want to change it, you not just only have to change the profit model, you have to change the financing, you have to change the expectations, and that's harder to do. I think it is easier to change the user because once the user stops engaging, it stops making sense for companies to use the same approach.
Thank you, Y-Vonne. That was fantastic.